Well, welcome everybody. My name is Stephen Wood. I'm the director of the Center for Law and Environment at the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. Welcome to a special webinar and keynote address by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Dr. David Boyd. We will get started right away. I just want to start with a couple of logistical notes for the audience who are joining us. We will we are streaming this live on Facebook. We have room in the Zoom webinar for 500 participants. And in the happy event that we fill that up, and you're not able to get in, you can follow on the live Facebook stream. We are also recording this to be archived on the website of the Center for Law and the Environment for future reference. We're going to take questions at the end of the session using the Q&A feature that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will not use the chat, and we're just not in a position to monitor the chat and the Q&A. So please refrain from using the chat, but do feel free to pose questions in the Q&A window at any time. And you can also upvote other people's questions. We will gather the questions and then moderate them and pose them to Dr. Boyd in the Q&A session. I would like to start the substantial part of the webinar by acknowledging that the law school and the UBC Vancouver campus are located on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. If we were there in the law school building, we would be almost literally in the shadow of the beautiful house post of Kipilanu, carved by the Musqueam carver Brent Sparrow in 2012, and standing guard there as the warriors of the Musqueam stood guard for generations against threats and dangers that might come to threaten the nation, and also as a continuing reminder of the sovereignty, the jurisdiction, and the law of the Musqueam people on this land. We are very privileged and lucky to be joined today to start off the webinar by Morgan Guerin, who is a member of the Musqueam First Nation, who will say some words of welcome to get us started. So I'm going to hand the virtual podium over now to Mr. Guerin with our thanks and gratitude.
Aichka, Stephen. My name is Siam Nisiaya, dear friends and relatives. Enta Setzeleno. My name is Morgan Guerin. My ancestral name is Setzeleno. I'm a member of the Musqueam First Nation, born and raised, and I always laughingly say, I even know where I'm going to be buried. It's my honor to do a bit of protocol work for you to start your day in a good way. A little explanation: when we say that we have someone coming to bring words of welcome, in the Musqueam tradition, we actually, as Stephen alluded to, we had a village in the area right adjacent to where our hall is. That village was called Colohan. And Colohan is where our warriors would be raised and trained to protect the people of Musqueam and the surrounding nations as well. We were the warriors to protect our relatives up the inlet and farther up river as well. So when we speak about law, it's a great honor that my seventh great grandfather's house post, Kaya Pilano, I am his 7th great grandson. I'm the great one. It was he who was sent out to bring these words of welcome. But before we can have these words of welcome, the warriors were dispatched and sent out to see the new visitors, ascertain if they came in peace, and more importantly, what work they had on their mind. Because we weren't just protecting the people of Musqueam, but also protecting the land that we have been asked to steward, this piece of Mother Earth. So I know today that everyone here is quite peaceful, because we can mute you if you're not. And I know the good work that you have come to open your hearts and minds to, as we say in the Longhouse, we have a nail on the outside of the Longhouse, and that's where you hang up all of the things that you know, your preconceived notions stay on side of that nail outside the Longhouse. So when you walk in, you have open heart, open mind, and open ears. That's not meant to say that you have to accept what you've heard once you've walked out, but you've come into that house in a good way. If you want what you had before, you can pick it up off the nail. If you don't, within 4 days, the winds will take it away, and what you've heard will become your new understanding, and let that grow. So I'll leave those little words with you. An understanding that we want to talk about, when I was asked to do this, it really hit my heart. Working within Musqueam my whole life, born and raised on the river, as well as being a fishery officer or enforcement officer, and now our lead marine planning specialist for Musqueam, as well as our enforcement coordinator, really taking that role of our old warriors watching after Mother Earth. And I'm starting to share this story my grandmother gave me, which I think really helps lend the perspective of the Musqueam people and many other people across all walks of life, all over this earth. We refer to ourselves as Hualmuch, and that's how we refer to another First Nation person, your First Nation. But there's a little more digging there. In the actual language, it really reflects the way the grammar breaks it apart, means you belong to the earth. Tamuch, earth. Hualmuch, you belong to that earth. So as you are born of the earth, you belong to it like a child belongs to its mother. And that means that there's a responsibility. Your mother looks after you, and you look after your mother. And that is a right that cannot be delineated. Nothing can stop Mother Earth from being your mother. And therefore, the responsibility also resides. Aboriginal right is only half of the struggle we face. The ability to have that responsibility to look after our mother, as we have always had, is the other half of the struggle. So first we had to prove she's our mother. Now we have to prove that it's still our right to look after her. And when I heard the urgent need for legal recognition and implementation of the human right of a healthy environment, well, as you can see, nothing would strike home so hard to that as we do in Musqueam. And I know on my other side of the world, on the other side of my family, come from far up in Norway. And my grandmother on that side gave me the exact same teachings as my grandmother, who was born and raised here. You belong to this, look after it. And it's not just for your selfish needs, what you need right now. But if you look after your mother, if she's looked after you, she'll help look after your children as well. So when we say the time is now, the time has always been now. We just need to start moving on that. So that said, Grandpa said, when you do this work, set the table, but don't eat the table. So I've said enough. And you've got quite the banquet behind us from Uncle Dr. David. And I think we got 2 of them tonight. To many of our other, I really am looking forward to hearing the conversation tonight. So that said, I can say with all my heart, on behalf of the Musqueam people, I virtually welcome you to our traditional and unceded territory. Walk with that glowing heart. Let it become part of you, the good parts that you want to grow. Another thing Grandpa said is, because I talk too much, don't give them a tree, give them a seed and tell them what it can look like. And I hope you plant those seeds well and nurture them, not just for us, but for every foot that walks behind us. I like that other saying where they say, the strength of, and I'll paraphrase, the strength of a society is gauged on the will of old men who plant trees knowing they'll never sit in the shade of them. So that said, on behalf of the Musqueam people, I welcome you. Aitsepka, Aitsepka.
Aichka, thank you so much, Morgan, sorry, Mr. Guerin. I really appreciate that. You can see that I was moved by your words, and it made me stumble over my own. As we move into the event, I just remembered that something I wanted to ask everybody who is watching and attending today, because we are doing this virtually. In addition to acknowledging the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation, I'd like to ask each of the people who's joined us today to just think about for a moment and acknowledge the traditional owners and stewards of the territory on which you happen to be sitting as you join us today. And with that, I would like to turn the podium over to the first of our honored guests who are going to give introductory remarks. If you're interested in detailed biographical information, there are bios on the web page for this event. I will keep that information to a minimum today, and I will say that we are delighted and honored to be joined, first of all, by Annamie Paul, who's a lawyer, activist, and the leader of the Green Party of Canada, to give some opening remarks. And Annamie's schedule allows her to join us for the first half of the event, after which she must go. So I wanted to let people know that in advance so it doesn't take anyone by surprise. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, Annamie, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. It is such a pleasure to be with you. And I come to you from the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. Thank you so very much for the welcome. Thank you so very much for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be with the two Dr. Davids as they share some of their wisdom with us tonight. And I don't want to take up too much time at all. And I also want to thank the Center for Law and the Environment for having me as well. I definitely do not want to take up too much time. I'm very sad that I can't be here for the whole event, but I know it's being recorded and I can't wait to see the rest of it. I'll just share a few thoughts perhaps of my own, and hopefully that will be a worthy contribution to the event. The theme, I think, is just wonderful, you know, the right to a healthy environment and what that means. When I was thinking about it myself earlier, I was thinking about my family's history. You know, we are also our history is partially informed by colonialism as well. We arrived in the Caribbean as part of the transatlantic slave trade, the indigenous peoples to those islands having been wiped out completely. That island became home, a very small one, a very tiny island in the Caribbean of about 9,000 or 10,000 people. The people there throughout my mother's life and my grandmother's lifetime lived very modestly. The island is a biosphere, a very small footprint, a very small environmental footprint, very much the people being interconnected to the lands. And now this is a place that it's entirely conceivable because it's a low-lying small island in the Caribbean due to rising sea levels, due to the degradation of the environment, that they will be displaced. Not having contributed to that fate for themselves and having had to create a a life on a place that is not indigenous to them. And so what is their recourse? What is the recourse for those who find themselves in that position? What should be the rights that they are able to enforce, and what mechanisms should they have to enforce those rights? This is an extremely timely question. It's one that is being discussed more and more and gaining more and more traction. Because let's say it plainly, we do have the right to a healthy environment. We do. People in Canada, peoples are all around the world have the right to a healthy environment. You cannot have, let's say, fully exercise other rights, whether it's the right to life, the right to a life with dignity, without that precondition of a healthy environment. And we know that people here in Canada are chronically exposed to a multitude of attacks on that right. We know that we are, while we might intuitively understand that we are still far from the realization of that particular right. And I am struck again, perhaps also because of my family's story, but also because of the moment we are living through. I'm constantly struck, and I perhaps want to use my remarks to underline that we are not all equally impacted by the lack of our access to this right to a healthy environment. We know that the ways that it manifests itself are particularly intersectional. In thinking about my remarks for this event, we looked and did some work and research looking back at what has been said about Canada's record in this area, for instance. And we know that just as recently as 2019, the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights concluded that Canada was absolutely failing to protect Indigenous peoples, racialized peoples, and low-income communities from the harmful effects of pollution and toxic chemicals. And that those two things, the exposure to toxins and toxic exposures and unhealthy environments, was inextricably linked to the question of discrimination. And the examples, of course, are almost countless. The term that is often used in the Canadian context and in other contexts is environmental racism. And by that, we're talking about racial discrimination in terms of policy making, the environment, the enforcement of regulations and laws that deliberately target communities of color. This is something that isn't in our past. It's not in our rearview mirror. It's something that when we think about the mercury poisoning at Grassy Narrows, or chemical valleys, poisoning of the air and the water through refineries, or the toxic dumps in Black communities in Nova Scotia, or the pipeline and gas developments that harm in sovereign Indigenous territories across our country, across Canada. We know that this is a reality. It's one that needs to be identified. It's one that needs to be called out. And particularly in this moment of pandemic, we once again have a reminder that the impact of our continued degradation of the natural world and the threat that it poses to health is not equally distributed. If you take the case of COVID, for instance, we know that this outbreak is zoonotic, that it was the result of decades of deforestation, increased contact with wildlife, and trade in wildlife. And of course, we've seen that COVID-19, whether it's in Canada or around the world, has disproportionately impacted racialized and low-income communities. And that's whether in terms of rates of infection or rates of economic loss. And so we have to understand that this is something that we have some say in, that these circumstances did not happen by chance, and that the communities that will be most affected by our lack of recognition and respect for the right to a healthy environment are going to continue to be, in many cases, the people who are least responsible for that. And so, you know, I don't want to tread too much on the potential remarks of our keynote speaker, but I do know, for instance, that there is, even within our party, but certainly well beyond it, an increasing movement and push to recognize ecocide, that being the mass damage and destruction of ecosystems and harm to nature that is both widespread and systematic. And this is because, you know, I remember exactly where I was at the moment that I turned to my partner and said, you know, people are going to start suing. People are going to start seeking damages. People are going to start calling this criminal negligence. This is what's going to happen next. And we have seen that over the last several years. We have seen here in Canada the cases that are being brought as well. And most recently, some of you will know, I'm sure, that the European Parliament has voted to urge the EU and its member states to promote the recognition of ecocide as an international crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And so in the case of Canada and in the case of our party, we know that Canada does not explicitly recognize the right to a healthy environment. We know that we continue to be an outlier in this regard as more and more countries do recognize that. And certainly our push as a party whose core values center around sustainability, social justice, and ecological wisdom, our commitment is to continue to advocate for that, to continue to advocate for the conditions that permit a healthy environment to exist, and therefore for that human right to be fully realized. And one of the things that, you know, let's say the bright lights that happened not too long ago, and which we're hoping to see more action on in the near future, is the report of the Cross-Partisan Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development, which in 2017 recommended that Parliament recognize the right to a healthy environment and amend the Canadian Environment Protection Act to recognize that right, to mention the importance of considering vulnerable populations, to recognize the principles in UNDRIP, that's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and to give greater force and effect to environmental rights. So like with many things in life, there is the talking and then there is the action. And what we're waiting for now is the action. This is something that should be put into the form of a bill. This is an opportunity for Canada, not even to demonstrate leadership so much as to catch up. And so as we look forward, we really need to, as I said, first name it and acknowledge it. Acknowledge those who are most in need of the recognition and respect of this human right, and then put that acknowledgement into real action. And one of the ways, of course, we can do that is by making sure that more of the people who are most directly impacted by the absence of this right and the absence of a healthy environment are there in the room when the policies and decisions are taken on their behalf. So I want to thank you for helping to feed that discussion. I want to thank you for your advocacy, those on the panel, because your work is so incredibly important, and to say that we are there to support it. I hope very much that there is a future for my mother and grandmother, and my grandmother's passed, but for all of my relatives on that low-lying island that want to believe that there is a future for them. And thank you for this opportunity to be with you this evening, and you know, extend greetings on behalf of our party.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful remarks. I am now going to pass the podium over to our next guest. Many of you will already know Dr. David Suzuki, and all I will say by way of introduction is that he is an emeritus professor at UBC, a companion of the Order of Canada, and a grandfather. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Suzuki.
Thank you very much for having me be part of your program. Thank you, Morgan, for that introduction. And I think your message is a very powerful one, that we who occupy your lands should very much take to heart. Now, I have to ask you a question, Morgan. We live in Kitsilano, right next to Kitsilano Pool there. Is that Musqueam territory, or is it Tsleil-Waututh or Squamish?
All the cousins will share.
So I acknowledge that we are on the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish people. I'm honored to be here and to present David Boyd. His credentials are presented in the program, so I'm glad I don't have to repeat them. David has a remarkable educational background, a PhD in resource management and environmental studies from UBC, a law degree from the University of Toronto, and a business degree from the University of Alberta. And those degrees, I think, have given him a unique perspective on environmental issues. Now, he's gone on to accumulate a CV that is the envy of most academics. I'm envious. He's been an activist as executive director of Sierra Legal Defense Fund, that is now Eco-Justice, a prolific author of books and articles on a wide variety of subjects, and co-chair of Vancouver's Greenest City Initiative, a wonderful, I think, successful project under Mayor Gregor Robertson. David is a professor at UBC, and he's now the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment. I was fortunate enough to attend David's speech at COP15 in Madrid in December 2019, and I was blown away by his unflinching call to action, delivered with passion and authority. And as a Canadian, I can tell you, I was very, very proud of his presentation. I believe David occupies a special place in the environmental movement in Canada, primarily as our brain. He's researched and thought deeply about the environmental crisis as an activist who examines the challenges and opportunities of solving the problems through the lenses of the law. Way back in the 1980s, peace activist Walt Taylor said to me, "We can achieve anything as long as we don't care who gets credit." And I always try to live up to Walt's advice as we battle on many different environmental fronts. But you know, environmental groups often end up competing with each other for a limited pot of money. And that can lead to territoriality and competition. But that's our weakness. And I've always appreciated that David has shared ideas with me and the David Suzuki Foundation, the DSF, that we have then taken on as a cause. Well, he's never demanded credit or boasted that it was his idea. He had this great idea of setting environmental targets and then working out how to achieve those targets in 25 years. He called it sustainability within a generation, a great idea which DSF took on as a major project. We called it SWAG. This was a time when the Liberals held sway in Ottawa, and enviros, including us, were in thick as thieves with Prime Minister Paul Martin. Paul talked like an environmentalist. He had been on the all-party Standing Committee on the Environment and Economy in 1989, when it had reported global warming represented such a threat to human survival that it had to be acted on immediately. David got appointed into the Prime Minister's office, well, PCO, he tells me, to implement sustainability within a generation as government policy. I must always assumed that Jim Fulton, who was our executive director at the time and had been a member of Parliament, was somehow involved. I've never known what that involvement was. However, David got the job. It was a real coup to be right in there with the Prime Minister. And I thought David could make Canada a leader in the world if the federal government adopted SWAG as a goal. Now, I have no idea what happened, but after only a year, David bugged out of Ottawa. And I'm still in the dark about why, although I've always assumed he wanted to come home to British Columbia. After returning to BC, he came up with another idea to enshrine the right to a healthy environment in our Constitution. Again, an idea DSF took on, and I traveled across Canada on what we called the Blue Dot Tour. And eventually we got hundreds of local governments and big cities, including Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, and Whitehorse, signed on to support the right to a healthy environment. Those municipal signatories eventually covered over half of all Canadians. And I feel it will become a part of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And David, you should be recognized for the enormous role that you had in that particular movement. Before the Blue Dot movement was even over, David came up with an even more profound issue, enshrining the rights of nature. I say all this simply to show that David's ideas have motivated many of us. He has been our brains, and we try to be his muscle. But he shares so generously with us without any demand for proprietary recognition. So I salute you, David, and thank you for your generosity in providing fuel for our work of environmentalists. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you today. Of course, I loved listening to Annemie and Morgan and David. I'm deeply honored to be sharing this virtual stage with Annemie Paul, and frankly flabbergasted by that flattering introduction by Dr. David Suzuki, who really inspired me to become an environmental lawyer 30 years ago when I read his book, It's a Matter of Survival. I'm just going to share my screen with you so that we can look at some beautiful pictures instead of my mug. So bear with me here. All right. You know, the audience for this event is scattered across the planet, but I'm speaking from Sideas, Pender Island in the Salish Sea between Vancouver and Victoria. This is the traditional territory of the Sayout First Nation, and it's also the home of the endangered southern resident killer whales. You know, scientists estimate that there are 100 billion planets in the Milky Way galaxy and more beyond in the universe. The Avengers even suggest that there may be a multiverse. But despite the best efforts of generations of scientific geniuses, there is only one planet we know that supports life: Earth. This beautiful blue-green orb is a miracle, chock a block full of natural wonders. And despite the hubris of people who suggest that we might live one day on Mars, Earth is the only home humanity is likely to ever know. And yet, my friends, we take this planet for granted, and we have inflicted cataclysmic harm upon it. When I was born in 1964, the global population was 3.2 billion people. Today, we're almost 8 billion. During my lifetime, the global economy has tripled, and greenhouse gas emissions have tripled. We have created a climate emergency that is wreaking havoc on people. And indeed, here is one of those Caribbean island nations that Annemie mentioned earlier that are really in jeopardy of their very existence because of climate change. We've created a nature crisis where maybe as many as 1 million species are at risk of extinction. And we have created pervasive pollution that kills 9 million people prematurely every year. And of course, the latest problem we've created is this surge in emerging infectious diseases, exemplified by this terrible COVID-19 pandemic. And as Annemie mentioned, human rights absolutely depend on healthy ecosystems and a safe climate. Among the human rights that are threatened and violated by the global environmental crisis are the rights to life, health, food, water, culture, an adequate standard of living, and the right to a healthy environment. Without functioning ecosystems, which depend in turn on healthy biodiversity, there would be no clean air to breathe, no safe water to drink, no nutritious food to eat. Healthy ecosystems also regulate the Earth's climate. recycle nutrients, filter air and water, and mitigate the impact of natural disasters. It's really extraordinary to think that a single teaspoon of healthy soil contains more than 1 billion microorganisms, algae, bacteria, fungi, and more that feed plants and protect plants from pests and pathogens. For decades, governments have signed treaties and made pledges to tackle climate change and to halt the decline of biodiversity, most notably in 1992 with the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biodiversity. In retrospect, it's an embarrassing litany of bold promises, big rhetoric, but timid action and broken promises. And so if we look at what's changed since 1992, we find that oil use is up 36%, natural gas use is up 82%, and coal use is up 68%. Overall, greenhouse gas emissions have risen more than 60%. Nations pledged in 2015 in the Paris Agreement to hold the increase in average global temperatures to 2 degrees and to strive to keep it to less than 1.5. And we are not on track to meet those commitments. The temperature has already risen 1.2 degrees, and we're not on track to meet those Paris targets. Similarly, none of the nature-saving targets that were agreed to by parties to the Biodiversity Convention in 2000 were met by 2010, none. And none of the Aichi biodiversity targets agreed to in 2010 were achieved by 2020. And my friends, as an environmental lawyer, I can tell you that the Achilles heel of international environmental laws, such as the Convention on Biodiversity and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, is the complete absence of enforcement mechanisms. States make these bold commitments, fail to fulfill them, and are never held accountable. Scientists' warnings have never been more clear or more dire. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Science Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the voices of Indigenous people and the voices of youth are all calling for rapid, systemic, and transformative changes in all aspects of society to address the global environmental crisis. And that's why there's such a vital and promising role for human rights. In recent centuries, human rights have served as a catalyst for exactly the kind of societal transformations that we need today. Transformations such as the abolition of slavery, the progress towards equality for women, and the end of apartheid. Rights are being strategically and successfully employed today by Indigenous peoples, by the LGBTQ+ community, by persons with disabilities. And of course, it's never simple or easy or quick, but there can be no doubt that human rights have sparked positive and in some cases, transformative changes. And when we talk about the global environmental crisis, there is a role for human rights here to help overcome the weakness of international environmental law. In 2019, the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, in the Urgenda case, ruled that the Dutch government had violated the human rights of its citizens, including the right to life, under the European Convention on Human Rights, by failing to take sufficiently ambitious action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The government's response after the court ordered it to make faster and deeper emissions cuts, well, the government of the Netherlands is closing coal plants early, investing billions of euros in renewable energy, putting solar panels on the roof of every school in the Netherlands, reducing the speed limit, and more. And so here's an equation that I've come up with. Environmental law plus human rights equals accountability. Climate change cases are being filed all over the world based on human rights. The Torres Strait Islanders and Indigenous people who live off the coast of Australia have filed a case against Australia with the UN Human Rights Committee, arguing that Australia's abysmal record on climate change violates their rights to life, health, and culture. Greta Thunberg and 15 other young people have filed a similar case before the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, again, asserting that inadequate climate action violates their rights. And in my role as the UN Special Rapporteur, I have intervened in both of these cases, and we should be seeing decisions sometime later this year. And even more powerful, though, than just using human rights in the context of the environment is the emergence and evolution of the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This right began appearing in the United States in state constitutions as early as 1970. At the international level, it was first recognized in the Stockholm Declaration, a political statement that came out of the world's first environmental summit at the global level in 1972. Portugal and Spain were the first countries to include this right in their constitutions, their highest and strongest laws, in 1976 and 1978, respectively. And now the right to a healthy environment is recognized constitutionally in more than 100 countries. It's found in the environmental laws of more than 100 countries. It's found in regional human rights treaties, such as the African Charter on Human and People's Rights in 1981, the San Salvador Protocol to the American Convention on Human Rights in 1988, the Aarhus Convention in 1998, the Arab Charter in 2004, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Declaration on Human Rights in 2012. And just last week, Mexico and Argentina ratified the Escazú Agreement, a powerful environmental and human rights treaty governing Latin America and the Caribbean. So in total, more than 80% of the nations of the world in law now recognize the right to a healthy environment. And that's incredible progress. Now, people ask me, David, what does it mean, this right to a healthy environment? And I say to them, it has really two main components. It has these substantive components and these procedural aspects. On the substantive side, it includes the right to breathe clean air, the right to safe and sufficient water, the right to healthy and sustainably produced food, the right to non-toxic environments in which people can live, work, study, and play, a safe climate, and healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, both on land and in water. And the right also comes with a toolkit of procedural rights, which include access to environmental information, public participation in environmental decision-making, and access to justice. The right also must be guided in its implementation by key principles, including non-discrimination, non-regression, precaution, and prevention. And people wonder, does it really make a difference? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Research from all around the world, not just my research, but research from hundreds of academics, demonstrates that the right to a healthy environment serves as a catalyst for stronger environmental laws and policies, improved implementation and enforcement of those policies, greater public participation in environmental decision-making, and most importantly, improved environmental performance. So research demonstrates that countries that recognize the right to a healthy environment have reduced air pollution more quickly, have reduced greenhouse gas emissions more quickly, have achieved access to safe drinking water for a larger share of their populations, and perform better on broad metrics of environmental performance. And I'm just going to take you on a whirlwind world tour and talk about some of the countries where this right has made a difference. And I could talk about this for a long time, but I'm going to show some restraint. Slovenia, an Eastern European country and a leading proponent of recognition of the right to a healthy environment, decided about 15 years ago to get serious about waste management. And in that 15-year period, they have reduced the amount of waste going to landfill from 76% to less than 7%, which makes Slovenia the leading country in Europe and probably the world in terms of recycling. Slovenia also increased the proportion of its land in national parks and other protected areas to over 40%. Costa Rica is another country that's really a force when it comes to recognizing the right to a healthy environment. They added it to their constitution in 1994. And since that time, Costa Rica has reversed a decades-long process of deforestation. They were less than a quarter of their land was still covered by forests in the early 1990s. And since that time, they've managed to get it up, that figure up to over half of Costa Rica's forests. Over half of the land in Costa Rica now covered by forests. They've increased the percentage of land in national parks and ecological reserves to almost 30%. Costa Rica generates 98% of its electricity from wind, solar, hydro, and geothermal. Costa Rica has passed laws banning open pit mining, banning offshore oil and gas development. Costa Rica uses carbon tax revenues to pay indigenous peoples and farmers to conserve and restore land. And they have a plan to become one of the world's first completely
Folks, we are just working on reconnecting, reestablishing that connection. Please bear with us. I'm sure we can do it. Just hold on and we will get Dr. Boyd back. We're still working on it, folks. Please hold on.
Maybe Morgan and I will have to provide comic relief or something. What do you say, Morgan?
Is he still there?
Yeah.
So folks, we've been in touch with David. Believe it or not, there's a power outage on Pender Island. The gods have spoken, but he's trying to dial back in on his iPhone. So we will get him back. And thank you so much for your patience. Just please bear with us.
the electrician and he had it all at his fingertips.
Well, maybe until you hook up, can I carry on the conversation in a slightly different way?
That would be lovely, yes.
I think really the challenge, you know, David has always broken new ground as far as I'm concerned, you know, looking at legal possibilities and implications. But I think there's something more profound with the way that we're living now. Humans have fundamentally changed in our relationship with the planet, and it's happened very, very suddenly. We are now the most numerous vertebrate on the planet. There've never been as many vertebrates as we are today. But we're not like a bird or a mouse or a rabbit. Of course, we have an enormous amount of technology used on our behalf. And when you add the human numbers and our technological muscle power, and then our consumptive demand in a globalized economy, we have become the major source of changes in the physical, chemical, and biological properties of the planet. That's why scientists refer to this as the Anthropocene epoch, the age of humans. We are now a geological force. And the problem is we don't know enough to be able to exert our demands on the planet in a way that avoids problems in the end. When DDT was found by Paul Mueller to be a potent insecticide, we thought that was great. He got a Nobel Prize in 1948. And then scientists discovered, oh my God, why are the birds disappearing? And they discovered a phenomenon we didn't know anything about called biomagnification. You concentrate up the food chain so that in the shell glands of birds, the DDT accumulates and the birds lay a thinner shell, and so they were breaking prematurely. Over and over again, we find that we're a very clever animal, but we don't know enough to anticipate what the consequences will be. And so given our enormous power, I think, you know, for 99% of human existence, for 95%, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. We had to carry everything we owned on our backs and follow animals and plants through the seasons on their migratory routes. And in that state, you know very well that you live, that nature is everything. Nature is the source of our very survival and our well-being. For all that time, humans lived within what they saw as a web. We were one strand in a web of relationships with other animal species, with plants, with air, with water, with soil, with sunlight. That was the world we lived in. And in that world, there is a tremendous reciprocity we gain from nature, but we owe responsibility. We have responsibilities. And this is what strikes me about the Oka crisis that's going on in Montreal right now. You remember the Oka crisis back a couple of decades ago, and the Pines, this little plot of land, it's not a big piece of land. It's certainly not a huge part of the Mohawks or Kanesatake, their future, economic future. But if you listen to what they're saying that we have a responsibility to care for that land. And they feel very strongly that responsibility. And so that responsibility says golf courses don't belong on the Pines. That responsibility says you don't build condominiums on that piece. And over and over again, we hear, Morgan referred to that too, the constant responsibility that comes with receiving nature's abundance and generosity. And in our society today, that reciprocity is what is missing. I hear it all the time with the COVID and the masks, it's my right to decide whether I want to wear a mask. There's no sense that when I breathe out, it goes straight up to my neighbor's nose. And what they're breathing over there is going up my nose. God damn it, that carries a responsibility. And yet this idea that I'm free to make up my own mind, free, but without responsibility. And I think the problem is that, sorry, David, I'm just eating up your time. I'll back out now, but I was saying, I think there's a deeper underlying issue here, and that is the way that we see our place in nature, which has always been, until very recently, ecocentric. We were a part of this web of life. But now we live in an anthropocentric world in which everything is about us. We're the center of the action. We're the dominant creature, and it's us to take whatever we want. And the problem is, as an environmentalist, it's, oh, well, we got to be a little more responsible and we've got to use laws and so on. But the very laws that we have, the very politics that we use, the very economic systems are all rigged, because nature is not the central foundation of any of these. Those are human constructs, and we've left nature out. And this is the problem. If we don't get off this, and then you say, how the hell are we going to go from an anthropocentric way of seeing ourselves to an ecocentric? Well, guess what? There are still people that cling to it, and they've been hammering at us for generations. That's it.
There we go.
Indigenous people around the world have it. I just sat in on a session of a program we've got called Reconciling Ways of Knowing, Indigenous Knowledge and Science. And we listened to Elder Dave Corshane in Winnipeg, and he laid it all out, the path towards a balance with nature. I mean, they've got it. Yeah. We just have to have enough respect to learn from them. So sorry, true. David, I didn't mean to derail your...
No, we had a brief power outage here, and it gave us the opportunity to hear a filibuster from David Suzuki, which is always a good thing. So I will go back to sharing my screen. I apologize profusely for that technological hiccup, but hopefully we won't be interrupted again. I was just waxing poetic about Costa Rica and their marvelous environmental record. And you know, Costa Rica is one of many countries that has taken the right to a healthy environment and been inspired by it. France added the right to a healthy environment to its constitution in 2004 in a very short but powerful document called the Charter for the Environment. And this was a catalyst for France to pass the world's first national law banning fracking. France then passed the world's first national law banning all uses of all bee-killing neonicotinoid pesticides. France has gone on to pass a law that prohibits French companies from exporting pesticides that are not authorized for use in France. And France is one of the first countries in the world to explicitly recognize that its citizens have the right, the human right, to breathe clean air. And that obligation is now they're being held accountable in a series of really fascinating court cases. Croatia is another strong proponent of the right to a healthy environment. And I received this communication directly from the government of Croatia, who said, the right to a healthy environment has contributed to protecting, conserving, and restoring biodiversity and healthy ecosystems by positioning nature protection at the top of the political agenda in Croatia. Conservation of nature is one of the highest values of our constitutional order. And Croatia has protected almost 40% of its land in national parks and ecological reserves. Another example from Argentina, where thanks to the right to a healthy environment, this watershed, the Matanza-Riachuelo watershed, which was once renowned as the most polluted watershed in South America, has been undergoing a multi-billion-dollar cleanup and restoration because of a court case based on the constitutional right to a healthy environment. And this has led to significant improvements in water quality, in air quality, and the quality of life for people living in the poorest parts of Buenos Aires. And they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a picture of a young boy whose family lived in a corrugated metal shack on the banks of the Riachuelo River. And his family has just been given, because of this right to a healthy environment court case, they've been given the key to a new unit of social housing. So this boy and his family, for the first time in his life, will live in a house with running water, with a toilet, and with electricity. That is the power of the right to a healthy environment. In the Philippines, the right to a healthy environment has been used to stop old growth logging and to spark a massive cleanup project for this highly polluted body of water right next to the capital, Manila Bay. And they are making progress. They are cleaning it up. They have dramatically reduced the levels of pollution in Manila Bay. In Chile, the right to a healthy environment has sparked the cleanup of this notorious environmental sacrifice zone in the community of Quintero Punchincavi. In Kenya, people used the right to a healthy environment to block a terrible idea, which was to build East Africa's first coal-fired power plant in Lamu. And a court said, nope, that's not consistent with the right to a healthy environment. In Mexico, a court intervened in a case brought by young people and stopped the tourism development that was destroying a mangrove ecosystem, ordered the corporation to stop and to clear up and restore that ecosystem. So that restoration project in Mexico is ongoing. In Colombia, a group of absolutely extraordinary children and youth, 25 young people, filed a lawsuit against their own government, arguing that deforestation in the Colombian portion of the Amazon is a violation of their right to a healthy environment. And this case was decided by the Supreme Court of Colombia in 2018. And the Supreme Court said, you're absolutely right, young people. Your right to a healthy environment is being violated by deforestation. And the court ordered the government to sit down with these kids and with the country's leading scientists and come up with a plan to rapidly end deforestation. And by the way, they also recognized that the Amazon itself has legal rights as part of that court decision in Colombia. Last fall in September, I appeared before the Supreme Court of Brazil in a really groundbreaking case that challenges the Bolsonaro government's policies on climate to determine whether they are consistent with Brazil's constitutional right to a healthy environment. And we should be getting the decision of the Supreme Court anytime now in that case. The case went very well, I would say, from an environmental perspective. I'm also participating in lawsuits in South Africa and Indonesia, where concerned citizens and civil society organizations are arguing that chronic toxic air pollution is a violation of their right to a healthy environment. So this is a case in Mpumalanga in South Africa, which Greenpeace says has the highest levels of nitrogen oxides in the air of any place in the world. And of course, the air quality in Jakarta, Indonesia is also completely terrible and far higher than World Health Organization guidelines. Last spring, on a brighter note, I presented a report to the UN Human Rights Council on good practices in the recognition and implementation of the right to a healthy environment. Managed to find over 500 examples of good practices from over 150 countries, such as the Great Green Wall in Africa, which involves 21 countries and is one of the most extraordinary, if not the most extraordinary, ecological restoration project in human history. Also, many other examples. Bhutan's constitution requires that country to maintain 60% of its land in forests in perpetuity. And so you can see these are examples where the rights are really making a difference. And I'll be honest, it doesn't always carry the day. So, last December, just before Christmas, the Supreme Court of Norway delivered a lump of coal in everyone's stockings by failing to overturn the government's decision to allow new petroleum exploration in the Arctic Ocean, despite Norway's constitutional right to a healthy environment. And so, and it's also true that in many countries where you have civil wars or extreme poverty or autocrats in charge, the right to a healthy environment is not a magic wand. But overall, the evidence is clear that it is a catalyst for positive changes. And that's why in my role as the UN Special Rapporteur, I'm really working to see if we can get the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, to pass for the first time a resolution recognizing this right. It's still not recognized for billions of people worldwide. 37 countries, including China, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and others, do not recognize it. Although I am hopeful that things will change soon in Canada and the United States. This right, in fact, has never been recognized at the global level. And the UN has been working on it since the early 1990s. And I did a rough back of the envelope calculation. Since the UN started debating whether to recognize the right to a healthy environment, more than 100 million people have died premature, preventable deaths because of environmental causes. Now that's an unfathomable statistic. And because the human brain really can't digest a number like that, I want to stop for a minute and share an image and a story. This is Ella Kissy-DeBras, a beautiful, radiant child from the United Kingdom. She loved music and swimming, and she dreamed of becoming a pilot. But her life was cut short in 2013 because of air pollution. She was 9 years old. She lived in a poor and heavily polluted area of London in England, and she suffered from severe asthma. Whenever air quality would really deteriorate, Ella would have a respiratory attack, and she was taken to the emergency room 27 times in the last 3 years of her life. And on February 15th, 2013, Ella didn't recover. Last year, there was a coroner's inquest into the cause of Ella's death. And the coroner found, for what I believe is the first time in the world, that air pollution was a direct cause of a specific person's death. More than 7 million people die prematurely each year because of air pollution, including hundreds of thousands of children dying at an even younger age than Ella. And so I urge you, the next time you hear an abstract statistic about environmental degradation, think of this beautiful kid, Ella Kissy-DeBras. We have the solutions for improving air quality. We have clean cook stoves that can clean indoor air quality. We can get rid of coal-fired power plants. We can shift to clean transportation. And by doing these things, we can prevent this invisible pandemic. And I believe that failing to do so is completely unconscionable. So it is time for the UN to recognize this right. And the good news is that there's unprecedented momentum towards United Nations recognition. I'm working with a group of states led by Costa Rica, Fiji, Finland, the Maldives, Monaco, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland, who have committed themselves to introducing a resolution on the right to a healthy environment, hopefully this year, but no later than next year. Last September, over 1,000 civil society organizations wrote to the Human Rights Council demanding urgent action. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the head of UN Environment, Inger Anderson, and the head of UNICEF, Henrietta Fore, have all called for United Nations recognition of this right. And people will ask, do UN resolutions make a difference? And the answer to that, again, is absolutely they do. In 2010, the United Nations recognized for the first time the right to water. And since then, the right to water has been added to constitutions, incorporated into laws and policies, and most importantly, has influenced court decisions and sparked greater government action to deliver on this promise. In Botswana in 2011, just 1 year after the UN resolution, the Court of Appeal referred directly to the resolution in ordering the government to restore the indigenous San people's access to water in a protected area, which they had been cut off from. In Paraguay, the UN resolution accelerated action that drove the percentage of rural residents with access to clean water from 50% to 99%. And here in Canada, a country that once opposed recognition of the right to water, the resolution at the United Nations caused a breakthrough. Since 2015, the government of Canada has partnered with Indigenous governments to build safe drinking water infrastructure for 98 Indigenous communities that had been suffering under long-term boil water advisories. A month ago, Canada announced an additional $1.5 billion to accelerate the construction of infrastructure in 48 remaining Indigenous communities. So let's talk about Canada for a few minutes. You know, Annemie referred to this earlier in her presentation, that Canada is widely perceived as this beautiful country, but is one of those 37 holdout countries that does not yet recognize the right to a healthy environment. We're doing all right in some areas, but we continue to be a microcosm of the environmental injustice that exists globally. I've witnessed the horrific industrial pollution pictured here and endured by the Aamjiwnaang First Nation near Sarnia, Ontario. I have actually toured the moonscapes of northern Alberta, created by tar sands development, which has, again, a devastating effect on Indigenous peoples. The Inuit are on the front lines of the climate crisis, with temperature increases substantially higher than the global average, which has potentially devastating consequences for their traditional way of life. The Black community in Shelburne, Nova Scotia has endured landfills, pollution, and lack of safe drinking water for decades. And more than 1 million low-income Canadians live less than 1 kilometer from a major source of industrial pollution, resulting in higher rates of hospitalization for heart disease, lung disease, and shorter life expectancies. So my friends, many, many people in Canada would benefit from recognition of the right to a healthy environment. And efforts led by the David Suzuki Foundation and EcoJustice to secure recognition of this right to a healthy environment have been ongoing for a decade now. In 2017, as Annemie mentioned, Parliament's Standing Committee on the Environment and Sustainable Development made a series of recommendations to strengthen the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is Canada's main pollution law, to include the right to a healthy environment. In 2019, in Prime Minister Trudeau's mandate letter to Jonathan Wilkinson, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, he instructed him to take the necessary steps to strengthen CEPA. The Prime Minister himself, Justin Trudeau, has said, and this is a direct quote, "It is a shame to me that we would have to be discussing this, that somehow it would be possible as a governing body, as a federal government, as a parliament, we would be putting forward bills and laws that would not take into account humans' rights to live in a healthy and ecologically balanced environment." So the Prime Minister's on board, the Environment Minister's on board. 90% of Canadians want the government to recognize this right. My friends, we are closer than we have ever been. We anticipate seeing a bill to modernize CEPA this spring. The time has really come for Canada to recognize the fundamental human right to live in a healthy environment and to expeditiously implement this right for all Canadians, but particularly for Indigenous people and those who are suffering a disproportionate burden. Adding the right to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act would be a great step forward. But one day, like David Suzuki, hopefully in my lifetime, a younger generation of Canadians, unburdened by the scars of Meech Lake and Charlottetown, will add the right to a healthy environment to Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where it belongs. Because the right to a healthy environment is fundamental to human life, dignity, and well-being, and it's at the heart of who we are as Canadians. So to just sum up this evening, states must not only recognize but implement the right to a healthy environment, which means taking a rights-based approach to the climate crisis, to biodiversity conservation, to air pollution, and the global water crisis. It means switching away from fossil fuels as fast as humanly possible. It means respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples to their lands, waters, and species that sustain their cultures, while protecting 30% or more of the world's lands and waters by 2030. It means creating a circular economy where everything we make and use can be reused, recycled, or safely composted. With COVID-19, humanity is paying a terrible price for ignoring the warnings of scientists. We must not make that same mistake again. We must understand that nature is not just a warehouse of resources for humans to exploit, but a community to which we are so remarkably fortunate to belong. After all, we share DNA with every living being on the planet. Universal recognition of this right, the right to a healthy environment, recognizes that our lives, our health, our well-being, and our dignity are utterly dependent on the health of this beautiful but beleaguered planet. We're not separate from or superior to nature, but we're intricately woven into its fabric. If we fail to employ a rights-based approach to protecting the earth, then future generations will live in an ecologically impoverished world, deprived of nature's critical life-sustaining contributions, ravaged by increasingly frequent pandemics, and riven by deepening environmental injustice. But if we place human rights and nature at the heart of the efforts to recover from the pandemic, humans can attain a just and sustainable future in which people live happy, healthy, and fulfilling lives in harmony with nature. Thank you to all of you for joining us this evening, and thank you for everything you all are doing to protect the people and planet that you love.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you so much for those inspiring comments. I also want to thank David Suzuki for taking advantage of that sudden transformation of our relationship with Zoom, and thus with David Boyd, to talk about the sudden transformation of humans' relationship to nature and what it implies for David Boyd's topic. we are ready to begin the Q&A. Just a reminder, if you have questions, don't use the raise hand feature or the chat, put them in the Q&A. We already have more than a dozen excellent questions that I will start to work my way through. I'll pose questions to David and invite him to answer. And if Dr. Suzuki has anything he'd like to add, that would be lovely too, as well as Morgan Guerin. The first question, David Boyd, comes from Robert. I can't see the end of Robert's last name, but it says, in Canada, what is the most optimistic path toward recognition of a right to a healthy environment? What are the advantages and disadvantages of court-based versus legislation-based solutions?
Great question, Robert. And so really there are a number of pathways. There's the legislative pathway, which we've discussed, which would be adding the right to a healthy environment to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And frankly, the right to a healthy environment is already recognized at the provincial level by Ontario and Quebec, at the territorial level by the 3 Northern Territories. So legislation is one route, but ultimately the right to a healthy environment in Canada should be recognized in the Constitution because it's our highest and strongest law. Constitutions are like a mirror of a nation's soul. They reflect who we are as a people and who we aspire to be. And to achieve constitutional protection of the right to a healthy environment, there are 3 options. One is through litigation, and there have been court cases launched that are attempting to use Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, to argue that the right to a healthy environment is implicit in that existing charter right. And cases similar to that have been successful in more than 20 countries around the world. So there are many precedents to be relied upon. It would take quite a breakthrough, and ultimately, I would expect it would have to be a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada. A second litigation pathway is through something called a judicial reference, which provincial and territorial governments can use to ask courts for their interpretation of a legal provision. So that's been used. It's a uniquely Canadian tool, but it's been used many, many times to settle important judicial questions. And so any provincial or territorial government could ask their Court of Appeal the question of whether Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, whether that includes an implicit right to a healthy environment. And that would be a fascinating legal process. And then the third and probably the most difficult pathway is through actually amending the Canadian Constitution. And the amending formula is very challenging. It requires 2/3 of the provinces plus resolutions of Parliament. And it's difficult to get 2/3 of the Canadian provinces to agree on anything, let alone something as momentous as this. But what I have found over the course of the past decade is I have literally not met anyone under the age of 40 who disagrees with constitutional recognition of the right to a healthy environment. So I think that people like old white guys like me need to get out of the way, and I have absolute confidence in younger generations that they will amend the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to include the right to a healthy environment.
Thank you so much for that. David, the next question, there, I've got it now, is from Eric Grace and asks, you referenced the positive examples of Slovenia, Costa Rica, and Netherlands in making laws to protect the environment. Do you have any ideas why these countries have taken action while the others, the laggards, have not?
Whew, that's a tough question. And the answer to that really is unique to each country. So, if you look at Costa Rica, for example, they actually had a court decision in 1992 that said the right to a healthy environment was implicit in other human rights in the Costa Rican Constitution. Then they had political leadership. And I think in a lot of cases, that's a common denominator. France was an example that I gave, and that was really a surprising turn of events in France where a conservative president, actually, it was, what was his name? Mitterrand, took the idea from his daughter who had suggested it. And then despite being perceived as a right-wing politician, made this push for recognition of the right to a healthy environment and a charter for the environment. In some countries, there have been waves of recognition of the right to a healthy environment. Another factor is that countries emulate what nearby countries are doing. So for example, in Eastern Europe, when the Soviet Union collapsed, every satellite country created a new constitution, and virtually all of those constitutions included the right to a healthy environment. Similarly, in Africa, the process of decolonization gave those countries the opportunity to draft new constitutions. And so African countries almost all have recognized the right to a healthy environment. And the same thing happened with the end of the military dictatorships in Latin America. So there's no silver bullet, but in Canada, what we really need is a popular uprising, which the David Suzuki Foundation and EcoJustice definitely stoked with their Blue Dot campaign. And what's been lacking is political leadership at the highest levels.
Thank you. The next question actually ties in with another strand of your work that David Suzuki mentioned, and it comes from Larissa, and it mentions that in India, the rivers Ganges and Yamuna were granted legal personhood, which allowed court action to be taken with respect to pollution. Although legal personhood was granted for more spiritual reasons, with respect to environmental protection, the result seems to be the same as the human right to a healthy environment would be. And Larissa's question is, in Canada, which legal route do you think would be more effective? Granting legal personhood to the environment itself, Mother Earth, or expanding human rights to include the right to a healthy environment?
Oh boy, that's a great question, Larissa. Thank you very much. So in Canada, I would say that, we're very close, as I've said, to recognition of the right to a healthy environment. We need to make a final push to get that across the goal line. But we're already starting to see legal recognition of the rights of nature, which is a new concept to many of us as Western trained lawyers, but which has incredibly deep roots, dating back literally thousands of years in Indigenous cultures around the world, but also here in Canada. And so the first rights of nature law actually written down and passed in Canada was by the Chilcotin First Nation here in British Columbia, who passed a law with respect to the rights of the Fraser River. So that's a terrific first step. But I think we need to get to the same place where New Zealand has gotten to, where New Zealand, the government of New Zealand has worked with the Indigenous Maori people to grant legal personhood in one instance to a river, the Whanganui River, in a second instance to an area that was formerly a national park, Te Urewera, and is in the process of passing a law to recognize a third natural ecosystem, Mount Taranaki, as a legal person. And so I think that New Zealand, because of its close similarities to Canada, is probably a better comparator than India or Ecuador or Bolivia, where the rights of nature are also being recognized. And in New Zealand, what's really fascinating is that some of the Te Urewera Act, for example, was passed in 2014. So we're starting to see the implementation. It's not just words on paper. And it's really fascinating because the Maori, by law, have a controlling number of seats on the stewardship body that's responsible for protecting the rights of Te Urewera. And they are really doing a bang-up job. They are turning things on its head, saying, we don't have to manage nature. We need to manage humans for nature. And in New Zealand, the two laws, the Whanganui River Law and the Te Urewera Law, they actually take the Crown's ownership of the land and they vest it in the legal persons created by the law. So the river now owns its own bed, and Te Urewera, the land, owns itself, which is just an absolutely mind-boggling idea from a Western perspective. What's really fascinating, though, is the development of a new strand of jurisprudence from Latin America, led by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and then emulated in Mexico and Colombia. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has issued an advisory opinion in 2017 about human rights and the environment. And they say that the right to a healthy environment is different from all other human rights, because not only does it protect air and water and the climate, but it also provides rights for forests, rivers, oceans, and other aspects of nature. So it's a healthy environment in terms of human health and ecosystem health. And that precedent has been followed by a number of courts in Colombia and the Supreme Court of Mexico, both of which have ruled that the right to a healthy environment has these two aspects: a human right to a healthy environment and the environment itself having the right to be well treated. So it's just really fascinating to see these developments.
I'm actually going to well, not switch gears exactly, but there was another question along the same lines, which invited the other panelists to reflect on the relationship between the human right to a healthy environment and the rights of nature. So I would just take this opportunity to ask David Suzuki and Morgan Guerin if they had any thoughts that they wanted to share along these lines.
I'll jump in for a quick second, actually, and it's actually to build off of what David was just talking about. My Maori relatives and Etiora, when they were preparing for their case, and when we talk about how close Canada actually is to this and how close it could potentially be, the precedents they set, they actually sent a delegation to Musqueam to talk over the Guerin case and the Sparrow case. Of course, I'll give a, for those who don't know the Sparrow case, I don't know what you're doing on this, but you know, at the end of the day, when the court ruled in favor of Musqueam that we had an Aboriginal right to fish, there's a key element in what we're talking about today. It wasn't the fact that we had the right to be given nutrition to eat and service our bodies or these mortal bodies we have, but that connection that we have, the Aboriginal right to actually engage in that action of fishing is just as important, whether we get the fish or not, because there's also that sense of place. Now, if we talk about that symbiont circle, that we're looking at that connection that I spoke about before, that Homo connection, where you actually need to have the same equal right to the base that you're extracting from and the responsibility that goes with it as well. So in Canada, we already have, and because they were a Commonwealth nation, they wanted to use Commonwealth law that would more easily transition, especially in something so groundbreaking. So this is something that has always been sort of there on the back burner. But of course, the Maori setup for their legislation is not the same that we have in Canada as well. They're set up much in a much stronger position to have these sort of conversations, where Canada is still working on that reconciliation bridge in order to be open to hear these conversations without the fear of we're going to lose something. And we're not losing something. This is a responsibility that we all have to take on, that we are all responsible for in this short period of time that we have on this earth. This is something that cannot be delegated away and should not be incumbent and put on one person to be the voice of that. This is something that we should all, and this is one of the conversations when we are looking at how these things are going to change, how they're going to become entrenched. In my career, over the span of 23 years working in fisheries, I was here at the beginning of when the Sparrow case was enacted. And I have actually watched how a constitutional case, although cited, and everybody reads about it, has been chipped away inside of Musqueam as well, through policy and policy after policy after policy, through different conservative governments, and even through the Liberal government themselves. Best management practices, these sort of things that come in. So it takes something a little more firm. That can be the seed that will definitely plant, but at the end of the day, it's going to require an immense change. And I think, David, you hit it bang on the head. Anybody under 40, and I just broke that number now, our job is to make sure that we hand it off and that torch runs with it and we let them. But the transition is to have no fear in letting them do that too as well. So just a few of my thoughts that have come over, and I really want to raise my hands to everyone who's spoken today, really from the bottom of my heart. As I said, Hualmuch has nothing to do with your race. It's how you live your life. And I'm hearing real Hualmuch words tonight. So, Aichka.
Well, if I can have an input, I'll tell you, David, I kind of had an epiphany at the last general meeting of the EcoTrust, or EcoJustice, I'm sorry, EcoJustice. I was there, and your wife was making a presentation about the successes that the that EcoJustice had had for the year. And I suddenly realized the problem with the whole thing is it's all based on us deciding on what we're going to do and how we're going to interact with, even conferring rights on nature. It's us that are doing it. It's all just too anthropocentric. We're still at the center calling the shots. Now, what we need in the change, James Gosnell was one of the great charismatic leaders of the Nisga'a people. And I remember him telling me the first time he ever encountered a clear cut. And he said he was walking along a path through the woods and he suddenly came to this opening and he said, I couldn't breathe. It was as if the earth had been skinned. And, it's just, he was outraged. He didn't have any sense of, he didn't need to know any science or anything or any laws to know that was wrong. If we had the sense that, if someone came along and came to your mother, your biological mother, and started to cut off her fingers and skin part of her body and pump poison into her, you don't need any laws or anything to know that's wrong, right? And that's what we need, is that sense of reinsertion back into that web of relationships that ensures that we stay alive and healthy. We've removed ourselves. One of the questions that you got, Stephan, was someone who said, well, do you blame science for getting us into this position of being so self-focused? I think science is a part of it, but my sense is that we've always lived within this web of relationships. We understood that. But then as we began, the agricultural revolution allowed us to live together in permanent structures, and we began to have ways of managing the way we interacted, and one of them was religion. And if you look at the Judeo-Christian tradition, although I don't think it's the only one, we began to see ourselves in a different way. When we see ourselves, a human being, Jesus Christ, was the Son of God, then obviously we're not seeing ourselves like the rest of creation. We're special. And when you look at Genesis 1 to 28, you see it right there. Go forth, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living thing that moves upon the earth. That's it. That was the injunction. And then during the Renaissance, you begin to, you get people like René Descartes, who says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And so you elevate the mind. That is our great survival strategy, was this thing up here. But we now say, the mind, I think I am, my very existence is my mind. That elevates it. And when you hear Francis Bacon, he says that scientia potestas est. Scientia is knowledge, but we've come to use the word for science. Knowledge is power. And he saw knowledge then through science as a way of empowering human beings to realize the dictates of the Bible. Go forth and subdue it. Have dominion over everything. And of course, with the Industrial Revolution, it seemed like it's true. Like we no longer have to live within natural laws. We can invent telescopes that let us see beyond anything any other organism can. We can see to the edge of the universe. Microscopes allow you to discover a world of life in a drop of water. And now machines can work tirelessly, moving enormous weights, and 24 hours a day. They don't even have to take a pee break or go to the go and eat lunch. They just work away doing this work. And we have machines that travel faster than any living organism. We can now live in outer space or under the oceans. We no longer have to pay attention to the laws of nature because we're so smart. And so I believe that science has contributed to that sense of domination and being smart. David said at the beginning, there are how many billion planets? We've only discovered other planets in the last 5 years. We didn't know there were any other planets. And now our galaxy is just one of billions of galaxies. What an incredible conceit. We think we're so goddamn smart that we're going to spread our seed throughout the universe. And we're going to, first of all, terraform. We're going to create a livable situation on the moon. Then we're going to terraform Mars. And I mean, let's get real here. Our home, as David said, the only one, even though we know there are billions of planets, it's still the only one where we know that there is life on this planet. And certainly for us, it's our only home. And we better find a radically different way of seeing ourselves in that web. So my problem, David, is I still think, you know, we've got to use law, as you're saying, in these ways to guide us, but the game is still fixed. It's fixed within a system that still puts us in the dominant position. And it's the same with the economy. The economy, for God's sakes, has blocked so much of what we need to do in terms of climate change and biodiversity protection. The economy is a driving force of the destruction. And yet, talk to Jason Kenney in Alberta, the economy, by God, if you're objecting to the economy and the way it's constructed, you're an enemy of Alberta. We had in BC, we had an NDP premier who called me the enemy of BC because we were opposing clear cutting of the forests in BC. So the economy is a driving force of what controls our actions. And of course, politics. The problem with politics is our system is based on people that vote. Well, guess what? The most important objects and people that are going to be affected by politicians, what they do or do not do now, don't vote. Children don't vote. Future generations don't vote. The air doesn't vote. Oceans don't vote. Fish don't vote. So it's our political system pretty constrained. So this is a problem. So long as we exist within this bubble that thinks we're so great. You know, it's great. Isn't it great that countries are protecting 40, 45, 50% of the land? But we're one species out of maybe 10 million species on Earth, and we think we can take over 50% for us?
Well, 50% would be an improvement over what we're doing now.
Oh yeah, and biologists are now saying, let's aim for 50%. I personally, we've got to put fences around people. Keep them out, for God's sakes. You know, it's.
But you know, David,
crazy.
This is the thing. This is why rights are so interesting, because it's not just about law. Rights are about culture, and culture can change through the lens of rights. If we think about the way we view Black people today or women today, I mean, our culture has, we haven't gotten all the way. Let me be clear. I'm not an apologist for racism or discrimination, but the change in recent human history in terms of how we perceive ourselves with others has been profound. And yes, we have a long ways to go. But the fact that, you know, now people generally recognize that women and men are equal, that's a huge change. You know, women didn't even have the right to vote 100 years ago. I mean, talk about people not having the right to vote, right? Indigenous people in Canada couldn't vote until 1960. I mean,
homosexuality was a crime. Homosexuality was a crime in Canada.
Right. And so that's my point. The culture has changed, and the culture has changed particularly dramatically amongst young Canadians, who young Canadians are, you know, they first of all, they really understand this whole environmental crisis that we're in. They are very egalitarian in their views. They are, my daughter is a classic example. She's 15. She's a climate activist. She's a Black Lives Matter activist. I mean, that's what young people, the way they see the world has changed dramatically in a very short time, and is a reason for hope. I mean, the millions and millions of kids that were on the streets before the pandemic, you know, calling for climate action. All of these kids all over the world filing lawsuits saying, hey, man, listen to us. We have the right to a safe climate. We have the right to healthy ecosystems. We have the right to a healthy environment. That's got to be some measure of optimism that can generate for us. Sorry, Stepan, we got sidetracked.
No, clearly we don't need questions to keep you guys going. That's brilliant. But we do have other questions from the audience. The next two questions that really caught my eye, and I'll pose them together and you can just decide how you'd like to respond to them, David. They do shift the gears a little bit, although one of them points to a theme that David Suzuki just raised. The first one is about access to justice, and I'll just paraphrase it. It comes from an anonymous attendee who's part of a group considering a legal action for environmental protection in court and is concerned about the main obstacle, which is cost. What would you say is the role of, or the connection between a human right to a healthy environment and the problem of access to justice and cost? That's the first one. And the other one is the theme of political economy. It's from Tarek Kudmani, and it says, would the right to a healthy environment in Canada conflict with Canada's enormous investments in the oil and gas industries? So two very different themes, but I thought I'd throw them out together and you can decide how to grapple with them.
Yes, sorry, can you just repeat the nexus, the first one again?
Oh, so the first one is the access to justice.
Yes, right.
Piece of the puzzle and cost
right.
of litigation.
Right. So what's really striking about recognition of the right to a healthy environment is that in many countries, it has provided a pathway to access to justice. So broadening the rules of standing, for example, creating expedited or faster processes, creating less expensive processes. And, you know, I would say that I'll give you a couple of examples. In the Philippines, for example, the Supreme Court of the Philippines created a special set of rules for environmental cases that allow basically anyone to go to court to assert their right to a healthy environment under the Filipino Constitution. And it has been used in many, many cases in the Philippines. In Latin America, which is really at the forefront of this movement, a number of countries have put in place different types of mechanisms to improve access to justice. So for example, in Costa Rica and many places, they have specialized environmental courts and tribunals that have the knowledge and expertise that frankly, Canadian courts simply don't have. And in a place like Costa Rica, they also have a provision where you can literally write a letter to the Constitutional Court of Costa Rica outlining an environmental concern, and they will appoint a lawyer to work on your behalf to bring that case forward. In Colombia, they have a provision that says if your constitutional rights to life, to health, or a healthy environment are in jeopardy, then when you file your case, a judge must hear your initial arguments within 10 days. I mean, that's absolutely extraordinary in terms of accelerating access to justice. And then we also have these two regional treaties, the Aarhus Convention on access to environmental information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters. And the Aarhus Convention was negotiated by the UN Economic Commission for Europe, but it was open to other countries. And in fact, Canada and the US participated in the negotiations, but then refused to ratify the final agreement. It's still open to us to do so. And in fact, just last year, the first African nation joined the Aarhus Convention as a party. And then in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's a similar new agreement called the Escazú Treaty on access to information, public participation, and access to justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that new treaty comes into force on Earth Day this year and really will reinforce access to justice throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. So definitely, and both the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Treaty in their purpose sections say that the purpose of these procedural environmental rights is to fulfill everyone's right to live in a healthy and sustainable environment. So it's an important set of tools to achieve the ultimate objective. And then the second question, which was about, what would be the impact of the right to a healthy environment in Canada, given our strong dependence on the oil and gas industry? Well, I think that what we're already seeing, we are in the end game of the fossil fuel industry. Coal is being knocked out. Canada has committed to closing down all coal-fired power plants by 2030. We have partnered with the United Kingdom to create something called the Powering Past Coal Coalition, which has got more than 30 countries who have signed on saying they will all end the use of coal by 2030. So that's good news for the environment. That's good news for people's health, good news for people's human rights. And frankly, oil and gas are next. We're seeing the beginnings of the transition away from fossil fuels. We have all these major countries, China, the United States, South Korea, Japan, saying we're going to get rid of fossil fuels by 2050. And that's absolutely critical to address the global climate emergency, absolutely critical. And so to the extent that recognition of the right to a healthy environment could accelerate the decline in the oil and gas industry, I think that it could. It could certainly be a tool in stopping new projects from going forward. It's being used in countries around the world to block additional oil and gas development. And I think that is certainly consistent with the meaning of the right to a healthy environment, to have a safe climate, to have healthy ecosystems, to have clean air. All of those things require the rapid demise of the fossil fuel industry.
Just a note that we probably have time for a small handful more of questions, depending on how much we sort of dwell on each one. And a reminder to people in the audience that you can upvote questions. At this stage, we have 36 questions in the queue. And so we will only see the ones with the most upvotes. So just go to it with your little upvote feature in the Q&A. The next question is from Josh Ash who's a PhD candidate and environmental lawyer in Pennsylvania. And I will paraphrase his question. There's a lot to it. But it has to do with the fear of setting bad precedents in court if you use these rights, these environmental rights, partly because they're so new and standards are still developing. Do you have any thoughts on this fear, tips to avoid the risk of bad precedents, and thoughts on whether it is really a valid concern?
Well, I think that, there are definitely strategic considerations to be taken into account. If you look at the problem of global climate emergency, then, choosing countries that have strong courts, that have strong records on environmental cases where there's strong legal recognition of the right to a healthy environment, I think that makes sense. But I also think we could learn a lesson from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples in the United States, who, they created a legal arm in the early 1920s. And in 1929, they generated a strategy document that sought to achieve equal rights for Black Americans over a course of 25 years, really a visionary document, if you can imagine that, in 1929. And then they just went out and their strategy had two components, education and litigation. And they went out and they hit the streets, they knocked on doors, and they knocked down the doors of courtrooms. And they filed case after case. And, they lost a lot of cases, but they eventually built momentum towards the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954, which was such a critical turning point in American history. I think that time is moving faster. We face an absolute crisis at the global level. And so there have to be more cases brought. It's not a question of, this is not a time for caution. This is a time to throw caution to the wind. And that's what we're seeing all over the world. We're seeing like an incredible proliferation of lawsuits about climate change. And I think that the next wave will be lawsuits about biological diversity. And we're starting to see the first cases like that. I was just talking to a colleague from the London School of Economics who's studying this tidal wave of climate litigation. And she said to me earlier this week that the climate litigation that tends to be most successful thus far are cases invoking human rights. And I thought that was really interesting because there have been more than 1,000 cases around the world. And it's clear that the human rights argument gives these cases a better chance of succeeding.
Oh, so thank you for that. I'm going to combine two questions that are currently at the top of the leaderboard, and they're from Jeanette and Benjamin, and they both really have to do with what actions ordinary people can take. Jeanette asks, what is the single most important action that individuals can take? And Benjamin asks just more generally, what can the average person do to support or promote the recognition of the right to a healthy environment?
Oh, super. I was hoping somebody would ask questions along these lines. And it's funny because David Suzuki and I wrote a book a few years ago, which we called David Suzuki's Green Guide. It wouldn't have sold any copies of it. It was called David Boyd's Green Guide. But, we talked about everything people can do in terms of their lifestyle patterns, their eating habits, where they live, how they get around. But ultimately, the thing that we concluded was the single most important thing is to become engaged politically, to use your vote, to only vote for people who respect the right to a healthy environment and who have strong, are inclined to take strong actions on climate change and protecting biodiversity, but not just voting, engaging to volunteer with political parties, engaging to support candidates, and really becoming active citizens in the basic sense of that word. And then in terms of what individuals can do specifically, I think I'll answer that at both the national level and the international level. Canada, as I said, is very close. We're expecting a bill to come out sometime this spring, which will be aiming at strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. I'm very confident, cautiously optimistic that will include recognition of the right to a healthy environment. There will be a huge pushback from industry, as there always is. And so we need Canadians to write, phone, email their members of parliament and get that support happening at the grassroots level so that politicians in Ottawa feel compelled to support those changes to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And then globally, there's this push for United Nations recognition, and people may go, well, what can I do about that? I'll give you two websites. One is called healthyenvironmentisaright.org. So healthyenvironmentisaright.org. And the other one is called oneplanetoneright.org. And that's one with the number one. So number one planet, oneright.org. And both of those websites will provide you with the opportunity to sign petitions. And you know, the idea is to get, we've already got over 100,000 signatures on the one. We've got over 1,000 human rights and environmental organizations on the other. But please, the bigger those numbers get, the stronger our voices are in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, in New York at the UN General Assembly.
Thank you. Another question comes from Pasquale Viola, and I'll paraphrase it really as asking whether a duty-based approach might be preferable to a rights-based one, particularly outside the context of countries in the sort of Western liberal democratic order. And it does remind me of Morgan Guerin's remarks at the very outset, which was talking about responsibilities as much as rights.
Right. Yes, and this is also a good question, and I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Professor John Borrows, who's probably he's definitely one of the greatest legal scholars Canada has ever produced, an Anishinaabe man and the author of an unbelievable number of books, including something called Canada's Indigenous Constitution. And I gave a talk at the University of Victoria a few years ago about the right to a healthy environment, and John, in his very quiet and charming way, came up to me afterwards and he said, you know, David, great talk, but you've got it backwards. You should be talking about people's environmental responsibilities first, and if they fulfill their responsibilities, then they have the right to live in a healthy environment, which is very much consistent with what Morgan was discussing earlier. And so I think it's not an either or question, right? When we talk about the right to a healthy environment, then by law, we're talking about state obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill that right. And so respect means they have to refrain from taking any actions as a government that could violate that right. Protect means they have to pass laws and enforce those laws to prevent third parties like corporations from infringing on people's rights. And then fulfill means they have to take positive actions. You know, building safe drinking water infrastructure in Indigenous communities is required to fulfill the Government of Canada's obligations related to the right to water. And each of us as an individual, we absolutely have responsibilities as well. And one of the really interesting things that's happened over the past 50 years in terms of constitutional changes is there's almost 100 constitutions now that mention individual responsibility to protect the environment. The problem is that constitutional law isn't enforced against individuals. So really this, to me, is more of a question of education on the responsibility side. And I think we absolutely have to change our education system so that ecological understanding is as important as reading, writing, and arithmetic. And ecological education should permeate our entire education system from kindergarten and preschool right through to high school and university, so that everyone is brought up understanding that we are completely dependent on nature for our well-being. And I think, you know, once people have that understanding, then the responsibility just becomes something that we take up naturally, and really brings us back to the Indigenous wisdom that both David, Morgan, and Anami have talked about earlier this evening.
I'm just going to throw out one last question, David, and it comes from Moritz. And again, I'm going to paraphrase it and perhaps take it a little bit out of context. But I hope Maurice will forgive and indulge my my modifications, but it has to do with countries in the global south. On the one hand, David, you pointed out that they've been leaders in legal recognition of the right to a healthy environment, and also, I might add, the rights of nature. But also they often face pressures to go for sort of quick and dirty avenues to economic development. So what can we do, or what can be done to help to sort of nudge them towards the more environmental rights protecting models of development? And how could a law-based approach, like you suggest, work in countries that have less of a sort of a strong tradition of democratic rule of law?
That is a very good and complex question. There's a number of elements of my response. One is that in some ways, the development imperative of the global south is being really assisted by the fact that the costs of renewable energy have come crashing down so dramatically in recent decades. You know, the cost of generating electricity with solar panels is now 99% less than it was in the 1970s. And even the International Energy Agency now says that in the majority of the world's countries, solar is the cheapest way to generate electricity. That's absolutely a game changer for the global south. I mean, you look at countries in Africa, countries in Latin America, countries in Asia, the potential of solar alone is absolutely enormous. And it's now not just an environmental thing, it's economically the best choice. But I also think there's a huge responsibility. We're talking about responsibilities. There's a huge responsibility on the wealthy countries of the world to assist in redirecting the global south onto a more sustainable development trajectory. We simply cannot afford a world in which they repeat our mistakes. They need to leapfrog us in terms of development patterns, and we need to provide financial assistance to make that happen. So, for example, one aspect of the Paris Agreement on climate change was that wealthy countries would mobilize at least $100 billion a year to assist the less developed countries and small island developing states in the transition. And that's a huge sum of that's a huge sum of money. Prior to the pandemic, we were getting close actually to that $100 billion target. We weren't quite there, and I think the pandemic has knocked it back. But that's, I believe, a moral imperative that we at least achieve that $100 billion a year with respect to climate change. We also should have a similar target in mind for biodiversity conservation. I mean, the great majority of the world's biological diversity is found in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. And so it's, and the development in those countries, the industrial development, is being driven by consumption in the global north. So we should have a basket of at least $100 billion that goes towards promoting and assisting biodiversity conservation in the global south. And there are countries like Norway, for example, like the Netherlands, like Finland, that are far exceeding what Canada is doing in terms of generosity through foreign aid or official development assistance, levels that are 3 or 4 times higher than what Canada and the US are doing. So Canada and the US and other laggards really need to step up in terms of our foreign aid. And then we need to direct foreign aid to climate-friendly, rights-friendly, biodiversity-friendly actions. I'll give you an example from Norway. Norway is literally putting billions of dollars into projects that have 2 objectives in the global south. Number 1 is protection of tropical rainforests, and number 2 is helping indigenous peoples gain legal title to their traditional territories. So those 2 things together are extremely powerful. We now have peer-reviewed Western science that tells us what Morgan says we should already know, which is that lands and waters managed by indigenous people have higher levels of biodiversity, have higher levels of carbon storage, and are better for human rights and the alleviation of poverty than lands managed by anyone else. I mean, if that's not a clear win-win-win situation, I don't know what is.
And it's probably worth adding that I think according to some figures I've seen, 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity hotspots are under the active stewardship of indigenous peoples.
Yeah,
so
and you know, Stepan, the last thing I would add is that there's, you know, in terms of climate change, we talk about mitigation, which is reducing emissions, ending deforestation. We talk about adaptation, which is preparing for the inevitable. But there's a third component of climate change action, which is always underappreciated, which is something called loss and damage, which small island states first raised in the UN negotiations 30 years ago. And loss and damage is intended to compensate small island developing states and the world's poorest countries for the impacts that climate change has already had upon them. And it's to our collective embarrassment as the wealthy North that not one single penny has changed hands as part of this loss and damage mechanism that has been talked about for 30 years. And so I'm again supporting the small island developing states who have proposed an air passenger travel levy. And you can again just do a quick and dirty back of the envelope calculation. If we paid $10 for a domestic flight and $40 for an international flight, that would raise, based on pre-pandemic levels of air travel, that would raise close to $100 billion a year to compensate these poor and small island countries that are really bearing the brunt of climate change. $10 or $40, that's not going to stop anybody from flying anywhere. So it's not going to address mitigation, but it sure as heck would provide a huge pot of money to compensate people who are really being hit hard by the climate crisis, hit hard now. So that's a really important mechanism to think about as well.
Thank you so much. This has been a marathon for you, David, and it's clear that our audience would love for you to just keep going. We have more questions in the queue now than we did when I last mentioned, but we have to draw things to a close. I would like to express our deep gratitude to Dr. David Boyd for speaking with us today, and also to Annamie Paul, the leader of the Federal Green Party, who started us off, to David Suzuki, who has stayed with us throughout, and also to Morgan Guerin, who stayed with us throughout. Thank you so much to all of you for your wisdom and for your work on these issues. And we're going to end it here. I want to thank the audience for your really wonderful questions that you posed, and also to the numerous people who actually supplied really interesting and useful information in the Q&A that can be basically shared with other audience members. Thank you to that. Thank you to everybody. Any closing words from the two Davids or Morgan?
Well, I'd just like to thank you, Stepan, for your work in organizing this event. And it was a real honor for me to share the stage with Morgan, David, and Annamie. So thanks to all of you.
No, I'm just, from the bottom of my heart, this has been a great conversation, a good feast of words, and really empowering. These in a field that I work in day out, sometimes you also run into attrition and you get tired sometimes, but it's good to hear from others. And especially with the chat and the Q&A, is to see these amazing sort of conversations and thoughts that are coming in. Build on those, continue with them, and make this world what we're supposed to leave it as.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. That is where we will leave it. The recording of this event will be available in relatively short order on the website, which you can find just by Googling Allard Center for Law and the Environment, and I'm sure you'll find it that way. Thank you, everybody. Thank you once again to our hosts on this territory, the Musqueam Nation, Haitchka, to you, Morgan, and to the nation. And thank you to everyone who joined us. And good evening.